Welcome back. My name is Jonah Beecroft. In this section, you will learn debit notes and credit notes and how they relate to each other. Debit notes and credit notes are used to document purchases return and sales return, as well as overcharge and undercharge. At the source of the debit note and credit note are from the two specialized journal, or the first specialized journal, which is the sales day book and the purchases day book and the return inward day book and the return outward day book. So a debit and a credit note are used to document sales and purchases return, as well as overcharge and undercharge due to what errors. Depending on who issued it, it may be issued by a seller or issued by what? A buyer. That means credit note and debit note can be issued by a seller or issued by what? A buyer. Now, depending on whether the debit or credit note is issued by what? The buyer or the seller, that is when we know whether it is talking about overcharge or undercharge or sales return or purchases what? Return. Whether a debit note must be issued first before a credit note. That is to say, a credit note is a response to a credit note. A debit note is a response to a credit note. Now we want to examine a debit note issued by the buyer toward the seller. A debit note issued by the buyer toward the seller. A debit note issued by the buyer to the seller. A debit note issued by the buyer to the seller. The buyer issued a debit note to the seller for two reasons. That is when the buyer issued a debit note to the seller. The first reason is if it returns some goods it purchases back towards the seller, then it issue a debit note to the seller. So, if he discovered that he has been overcharged due to error, if it discovered that he had been overcharged due to what? Error, he will send a debit note to the seller to inform him of the purchases return and the undercharge due to error, whichever that has occurred. He will send a debit note to the seller to inform him or her of the purchases return or the overcharge due to error, whichever that occurred. Yes. Now, the seller, when he receives the debit note from the buyer and agree that actually there was an overcharge, then he will he debits he will issue acknowledgement. He will acknowledge it by issuing a credit note to the buyer. Yes. When the seller receives the debit note issued by the buyer, he will acknowledge it by issuing a credit note to the buyer. A debit note issued by the buyer and acknowledged by the seller's issuance of a credit note has the effect of reducing what the buyer, reducing the amount the buyer will pay to the seller. Yes. We reduce or have the effect of reducing the amount the buyer will pay or the buyer will pay to the seller. This is the effect. That means the buyer is complaining of overcharge. That's the effect of reducing the amount the buyer will pay to the seller. Yes. Now let us examine a debit note issued by the seller to the buyer. A debit note issued by the seller to the buyer is complaining of undercharge. When a seller issues a debit note to a buyer, the seller is complaining or reporting of undercharge, and it does this for two reasons. When there is undercharge of to the buyer, or when it supply additional goods or services to the buyer. Now, the seller may issue a debit note to the buyer for two major reasons. One, when the buyer is undercharged, or if the buyer is undercharged. Two, if the buyer receive additional supply from the seller. If the seller supply additional goods to the buyer. These are the two major reasons why a seller may issue a credit note to the buyer. In this case, the seller is requesting or complaining of undercharge. And when the buyer receives a debit note from the seller and asserting that actually there was undercharge, or he has received additional goods or services from the seller, then he will acknowledge that debit note by issuing a credit note to the seller. Yes. That is to say, a credit note is an acknowledgement to a debit note. There will be no credit note if there is no debit note. A debit note must come first before a credit note. A debit note may come in form of formal complaint without even writing, and the respondent will now respond with a credit note. Upon receipt of the debit note, the buyer issues Upon receipt of the debit note, the buyer acknowledges the undercharge by issuing a credit note to the seller, the result of which will increase the amount the buyer will pay to the seller. From the above, it implies that a debit note is a complaint memo of overcharge or undercharge, depending on who issues it. It may be issued by the complainant, by a buyer, or issued by what? The seller. Yes. A debit note from the buyer to the seller is a complaint or a report of overcharge, and a debit note from the seller to the buyer is a report or a complaint of undercharge. That is the interrelationship. A debit note must come first in form of formal letter, formal or honorary complaint. Then, in response to a debit note, then you will have a credit note. Now let us examine how the debit note look like. This is now a debit note from Skyward Stationery Store. Skyward Stationery Store bought a Sanyo radio, and when he got home, when he texted it, he discovered that the Sanyo radio was defective, and he decided to return the Sanyo radio. And when he returned the Sanyo radio, it issued a debit note to the seller, Skyward Venture. Now, Skyward Stores, 32 East Circular Road, Open Number, Delta State. And the debit note number is 290. And the date of issue is 30th May 2025. And the place of issue is OB number. This debit note is billed to Skyward Venture, that is his shop or the store he purchased the Sanyo radio. And Skyward Venture is located at 36 Ogbofu Street. Now we are going to specify the quantity and the amount here. The quantity of the thing returned and the amount of the object returned. Now the quantity here is 1 Sanyo radio set, and the amount is what? 25,000 naira. And we put a description here, a return of 1 Sanyo radio set. That is the description. Now, the authority issuing this radio set, which is Skyward Stationery, we sign and fix what? The dates. And if there is they have a special stamp, they stamp it. Now, this is a formal memo. At times, the debit note is called debit memo, a formal memo to Skyward Venture complaining that he returned a 1 Sanyo radio set and he needed the money to be returned back to him. Acknowledging the debit note, Skyward Venture will issue a credit note. You can see the credit note from Skyward Venture, number 36 Ogbofu Street, Open Number, Delta State, Nigeria. The debit note number is 306, and the date of issue is 22 June 2025. Now, this credit note is issued to Skyward Venture, who had earlier issued a debit note. Skyward stationery store. Why was it issued? Say, we acknowledge your debit note number DN290 of May 30th, 2025 for the sum of what? 25,000 naira. For reasons stated below. Yeah. What are the reasons? What are the reasons stated for the debit notes? The reason is return of one defective SAYO radio set. And what next? The authority issuing this credit note will sign. And the authority there, who may be the accountant or the account clerk or the manager, is Mrs. M. Brown. And if they have an official stamp, they seal it, they sign it, they stamp it here. And Mrs. M. Brown will append his or her signature with dates. This is a sample of a credit note in response to a debit note. From the above, then we can define a credit note as a memo of acknowledgement of a complaint in a debit note. I repeat, a memo of acknowledgement of a complaint in a debit note. It can be issued by a buyer or a seller in response to a debit note received. On this note, we come to the end of this tutorial. If this tutorial impacted you in any way, we appeal to you to like it and share it to others so that they will benefit. In our next tutorial, which is going to be our control accounts, we are looking forward to seeing you, and it's going to come within a very short time. Thank you for learning with us.